Hey everybody, this is Maxine Taylor with another edition of Move Into the Magic, and I am so thrilled to once again present to you a dear friend of mine, Roberta Grimes. If you have followed my shows, you know that she is a frequent guest because her books are #1 bestsellers all over the world. They've been translated many times over. For those of you who may be visiting with Roberta Grimes for the first time, she is the author of The Fun of Dying, The Fun of Staying in Touch. These are just a couple of the books she's written. Liberating Jesus, which is one of my favorites. The Fun of Growing Forever. And she's here today because she has written a powerful new book with Kelly Glover. It is called The Fun of Living Together. The title doesn't even begin to describe what this book is about. And those of you who are Roberta Grimes fans want me to stop talking and introduce her. So Roberta, welcome, darling, one more time to Move Into the Magic.
Thank you, Maxine.
I've got to read the dedication in the book, if I may, because that really has to be part of the introduction. The Fun of Living Together. Here's the intro. This book is dedicated to every child whose ancestors were held in American slavery. Dear beautiful lights of tomorrow, your time has come. Now, Roberta, tell us about this book, how it started, who Kelly is, and what the biggest problem that we have seems to be, and the solution. On your mark, get set, go.
That's not asking much, is it? Well, the subtitle is, We Must Learn to Live Together as Brothers or Perish Together as Fools. And that's, of course, from Dr. Martin Luther King. We have an intractable problem. We've inherited it. But so did our founding fathers inherit it. Nobody, this problem goes back to the early 1600s, and that is racial separation in the United States.
Yes.
And that actually is the source of so many problems that we don't even realize it's associated with, that it almost despairs you when you even think about it. Kelly is a very dear friend of mine. We've been friends for a decade. We really never talked about race. But one day I started asking her questions, and the answers she gave me floored me. Most white people have no understanding. Here she is. She's upper middle class. Her father was a PhD college president, and she still lives as a second-class American citizen. She has a master's degree. I mean, it's time to put an end to it. So when I realized how bad it was, and I'm sorry, I'm clueless, I hadn't understood it before, I started to do research. I'm confident now about what happened, why it happened, and how we can end all our racial divisions in one generation.
Wow.
Time has come to do that, and we can do it. But in order to fix it, we have to understand what went wrong. Thomas Jefferson wrote our creed when he was only 33 as part of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, 90 years later, when he was facing he had inherited the same problem Thomas inherited, and that was the problem of slavery and racial division. And Abraham Lincoln noted that those words were not necessary to effect our separation from Great Britain. So he speculated they must have been put in our Declaration of Independence, not for that, but for later use. And he was right. Thomas Jefferson was an ardent abolitionist when he was young. And he was an abolitionist because he had inherited basically the same problem we have, but for him it was personal, because he also inherited people. And he didn't want any part of slavery, but he didn't know what to do about it. So he set out, and he was very young, before the Revolutionary War, to end it, to fix the problem. But because he also inherited relatives, he inherited his wife's stepmother, who was beloved, and 6 mixed-race siblings, he understood that you don't just free the slaves and say goodbye and good luck. What you've got to do is empower them. You've got to emancipate them in a way that they can live full and free and happy lives on this continent. That was what he set out to do. And few people know that in 1778, thanks to his work, as he began to do what he thought would be his life's work, Virginia, of all places, became the first place on the face of the earth to ban the importation of people as chattel slaves. That's how he was going to start it. In 1781, he retired. He had a plan. I've seen his plan. I know it would have worked. But the next year, Martha died, and he was never the same man after. He went to France to negotiate the peace, and the rest is history. He never got to do what he had set out to do. So he inherited a problem he couldn't fix. 90 years later, Abraham Lincoln inherited a problem he couldn't fix. 100 years after that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, excuse me, folks, but isn't this supposed to be your creed? Aren't you supposed to be living up to it? And because what he did with love. He was an angry man. There's no question about that. Because what he did with love, he was able to do more than anybody else ever has done to fix this. But if anyone doubts that slavery still existed in the United States in the 1960s, 100 years after legal emancipation, all you have to do is read Letter from Birmingham Jail. He had a PhD. He was another 33-year-old brilliant man, a PhD, and he was as much enslaved, except that he didn't have an individual owner, as his ancestors had been. Slavery still exists today, and it exists today because what the United States decided to do in all its benevolent cluelessness was begin in 1965 to pay poor women to evict the fathers from their children's lives. Nearly all of the problems we associate with the racial divide come directly from 50 years of running so far in the wrong direction. Because yes, there are, white people who take welfare, but most of the poor people, most of the black people at the time were very poor. And if in order to make sure your family survives and has enough to eat, you've got to leave, you do that. The statistics today will break your heart. 1/3 of black people live in poverty to this day, specifically black children. 2/3 of black children still grow up without fathers. And the results are plain to see in our cities. 1/3 of black men today are cycling in and out of prison. The comparable statistic for white men, 5%. Half of homicide victims in this country are black. Now, black people are 13% of the population, but they're half the homicide victims. Nearly all their murderers are black too, and we know what that is. That's young Americans killing other young Americans in America's cities. That's what it is. So if there are a ton of statistics like this you can find, but the situation is desperate. I would argue that in some ways it's more desperate than it was when Thomas Jefferson inherited the problem or Abraham Lincoln inherited the problem, because we have so much more to fix that we didn't have to fix before. We know some things, though, that they didn't know. One thing we know for certain and has been demonstrated over and over again is that there's no difference between the races. That's something people believe in. They worried about that. I mean, Jefferson worried about it because in his day, there was almost no racial mixing. His wife's stepmother was a rarity. She was half white and half black, and the children were really a curiosity because they were 3/4 white. There were no people like that back then. I mean, now we know that we are all identical people. We can come together. That's the really good news. There's nothing about our situation that's not soluble. So that's what our book is about. We recite what the problem is, how we know that's the problem. I mean, another thing that's foolish that people will say is, well, racism is inherent. I just saw a study done with 6-month-old babies that was meant to prove that racism is inherent. That is absolute hogwash. People are not racist by nature. I mean, I know that because of my personal experiences, but my children grew up, our next door neighbors while they were young, were Dick Gregory and his family. And if there was ever a character, it's that man. He was a comedian in the 60s who I saw him perform. He was both the most angry black man you ever saw and the funniest. And he was very, very good. when I knew him personally, because he was our neighbor, I didn't see him much. He was still traveling a lot, even in the late 70s, early 80s. He was full of anger, but it was a gentle kind of anger. It was we've got to deal with this kind of anger. But nothing is about this problem is insoluble. And what must our goal be? Our goal must be an absolutely colorblind society. So many of the things that we are doing are just headlong running in the wrong direction. The worst, of course, was the war on poverty, which accomplished nothing good. It moved the needle on poverty in this country, I think, by 1.5%. If they had left well enough alone and simply empowered the Black people they had finally freed, thanks to Dr. King, but that's all they'd done, we'd have less poverty now by far than we do have. But so many mistakes have been made. I mean, all this these well-meaning attempts to instill pride in Black people by separating them from white people, that's running headlong in the wrong direction. There's no way Black people can prosper in this country if they're trying to live in opposition to white people, because they're only 13%. This sense that we don't have to integrate and become one culture, that's running in the wrong direction. All it does is divide Americans. So what must our goal be? Our goal must be a completely colorblind, fully integrated society. I mean, the things that we like, in fact, let's be frank, Black culture is sort of American culture. Look at it now, and a few years later, it's going to be American culture. So they're not going to lose anything by fully integrating, and yet what they'll win is empowerment. I mean, we've learned some things. And by the way, say something, Maxine. I feel like I'm just lecturing. Ask a question.
I love what you're saying. I'm just, of course, I'm waiting for the solution in detail. Naturally, as everybody in our audience probably is. But what you're saying is so timely and so important. You are doing great. I'll just sit here and listen to you.
Okay. All right. Okay, what do we have to do to fix this? Well, first, we've got to understand what we've done wrong, because frankly, we've done everything wrong. We've learned some things. The first thing we've learned is you don't help people when you give them stuff. You have to empower them. That's the only way you can help people. People need to feel good about themselves. They need to feel that they can do it. And no adult should be getting a handout for life. And I think it's profound racism to think that Black people can't survive on their own. They'll prosper if we just leave them alone. Someone wrote a book called Please Stop Helping Us. And it's all about how we've screwed things up so badly by just trying to help. Stop helping. Instead, empower people. The second thing we've learned is that we all have the right to live in intact families. If you look at the census for 1960, we had the same percentage of intact Black families as intact white families. All through the hell that they had been through for hundreds of years, the Black family stayed together, the Black community was strong. In the 1980 census, nearly all those Black families had broken up. So what slavery couldn't do, what Jim Crow couldn't do, what every bit of oppression couldn't do, the federal government did by trying to help in only one generation. All these things only made it worse. So how do we undo that? Ideally, we would be able to do what we could have done as late as 1965 and simply welcome Black people into American society. Empower them, make them feel good. When my grandparents came in the early 20th century through Ellis Island, become a citizen, raise your hand. They were welcomed. We have never to this moment welcomed the Black people in this country. Instead, we've treated them, I say in the fun of living together, like barnacles on our ship of state. They've always been here. We've always had to deal with that fact, but we've never said, we're glad you're here. We need to do that. We have some very important milestones coming up. In next year, 2018, it'll be the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death. We've got to celebrate the fact that he was the greatest American of the 20th century. And I can give you a host of reasons why he is the one who was the greatest American. Not the greatest Black person, the greatest American. And then in 2019, it'll be our year of Jubilee, 400 years since slavery started here, and we can celebrate the end of it. Because there's one thing I think we've got to do, and that is we've got to erase the mistakes that the government has made right back to 150 years ago. And the only way to do that is to cut the tail of slavery that still exists, because we've never done anything about it. So what we're recommending, Kelly and I, is that for a 30-year period, every child born in this country who has one ancestor, whoever was held in slavery, should get a full, free education at the very best private schools in the country, from preschool through graduate school. Why? Because what we have done has not, they're not at neutral. They're down, they've been harmed, and it's not their fault. But anybody walking down a street in America today and seeing a Black person they don't know immediately thinks less, right? Obviously grew up without a father, terrible education. By the way, there's more segregation now in American schooling than there was at the time of Brown versus Board of Education. Their schools are terrible. You assume that person, probably grew up on welfare or is poor, and you assume that he may well have a prison record. 1 in 3, what are the odds? This isn't racist thinking this way. This is just being a person who reasons from experience. But we did that. We as a country, trying to do the best we could possibly do. I'm sorry. We in this country did that. And we've got to reverse it. We've put a brand X, and it was my dear neighbor when my kids were growing up, Dick Gregory, he was the first person who ever said to me, brand X, we're brand X. And that was less than 20 years after we started this horrible war on poverty. And he's right. On the forehead of every Black person today is a label. That label is brand X, less, right? Doesn't have to be that way. No, it's a rebuttable presumption. You say hello to him and he says, hi, my name is Steve Harvey, or my name is Tyler Perry. And he's brand elite. We have the power to make every Black person 30 years from now brand elite, and let them reintroduce themselves fairly to the American people for what they can do without any restrictions on their lives. And that's the only way to fix this. There's no other way, and it will never get better on its own. So that's the key, most important thing that we need to do. And I think we can do it almost without a penny of taxpayer money. We start with vouchers, of course. But if we explain to the American people what we're doing, and if we give them the right tax incentives, and if we interest the foundations, if we do it right, this will be the greatest thing we have ever done as Americans since the founding of this country. Our founders had a vision for the United States, a full and free and happy and powerful nation where everybody has a fair chance to rise. That was their vision. To this day, we've never had it. We have the power to grasp that now. And the country that we will come out of this with will be powerful and free and happy beyond anyone's imagination. It was Dr. King's dream. He dreamed his kids would one day be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We have the power to make that come true. He said he had been to the top of the mountain and he had looked over and seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. He didn't. I may not get there with you, but I'm telling you tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Now, he wasn't talking about Black people, was he? Because they're only 13% of the population. There's no promised land for them. There's only a promised land for us. And the only way we get there is together. There is no other way. And the only way to do it is to fix all the mistakes we've been making for the last 150 years. Everybody who's inherited the problem has tried to make it better. But because they've never understood what was necessary, they've only made it worse. We can fix it today. With the right incentives, we can fix it without any help from the federal government. But we'll also be contributing to the federal government in the most powerful possible way, because our biggest problem is spending, right? And there's no way to fix our spending because 2/3 of the spending is entitlements. You can't get rid of them unless you empower the people. If we assume that 10% of the people who are who are Black in this country are not working up to their own potential, maybe are getting welfare, maybe are in prison. 40% of the Black male of the population of male prisons is Black. 40%. What would it be like if we could empty our prisons? How much money would we save? How much money would we save if no Black woman ever again needed to take welfare, because she and her and the father of her children and all the children were being educated well. We can reduce our spending dramatically by doing this. And guess what? They haven't been productive, have they? Even those who have never taken welfare, never been to prison, still aren't in this country allowed to work up to their potential. When they are, they'll pay taxes. So we can lower our spending in a quite legitimate way and raise our tax revenues, again, without taxing anybody else. We have been idling close to 10% of the American population for 150 years. Idling in that they couldn't contribute. When they start to contribute, they'll cause an economic boom in this country like we cannot imagine. There's so much good to come out of doing this simple thing, taking one generation and educating them and putting on their label, their forehead, that label, brand elite. So everybody sees them as uniformly well-educated, highly successful people. That's all we need to do. And if we don't do it, there is no other way, I'm confident, to fix this problem. I'd love to have other people come up with ways to fix it. I don't see any other way, and I've looked hard. But again, I think we can do this. It'll be easy. It'll make us all happy, and there's no reason not to do it. So that's my solution, dear.
My word, this is just powerful, powerful. I'm sure people in our audience will have mixed reactions to what you're sharing, to what you have to share here. And I commend you and Kelly Glover for putting this out right now at this time. And I hear your solution. Well, what is the first step that someone can take on their own to implement this?
I think the first step each of us has got to do is satisfy ourselves about what the truth is, because many people have misunderstandings, just mistaken thoughts about this. Because we've handled it, we as a people, we as a country, with all the best of intention, have handled it so badly, it persists. I think one argument that we can have would be, well, why does it persist? Many people will say we're inherently racist. That's bogus. That's wrong. Or there really is a difference. Again, there's no difference. The difference is in how people have been treated in this country. And people will act in a way that we have trained them to act. I mean, we took the slaves, when they were first freed, had been treated like animals all their lives. They had never been educated. They had always been told they could never be part of the American dream. And there was never a moment from that day to this, over 150 years, that we ever have told them differently. Some of them have succeeded in breaking out of that.
Yes, many.
Yes, but most of them have not.
This book, The Fun of Living Together. Everybody go out and get it. Just buy it. It's available on Amazon, correct, Roberta?
Yeah, it should be available through bookstores too, but as you know, nowadays bookstores carry only bestsellers, and this is just out.
It's just out. Roberta Grimes is the author. Darling, thank you again for being my guest. This is a profound concept, a profound book, and I hope you'll come back again, and let's talk again at the next juncture, because as you said, the next few years are going to be celebratory. That's how I look at it, celebratory.
They will be.
And the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this show. I know it's brought up many thoughts, many ideas. So until we meet again, remember that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.